I never thought I'd be sitting in a notary's office at 65, watching my son-in-law try to strip me of my dignity. But there I was, clutching my leather purse with white knuckles, while Roger smugly informed the notary that I was confused and unable to manage my own affairs. "She doesn't even know what she's doing," he said with practiced concern, not even looking at me. "My wife and I are just trying to help her transition into assisted living smoothly." The notary, a young woman named Miss Patterson with kind eyes, glanced at me uncertainly. I could see what she was thinking. Gray-haired widow, slightly trembling hands, probably early-stage dementia. I'd seen that look before, at the bank, at doctor's offices, even at the grocery store when I took too long counting out exact change. But I wasn't confused. I was furious. "Actually," I said, opening my purse with deliberate calm, "I believe this might clear things up." I slid the document across the desk, my updated power of attorney, properly notarized last week by Miss Patterson's colleague, removing Roger and my daughter Elizabeth as my financial proxies. In their place was my younger sister Margaret's name. The color drained from Roger's face as Miss Patterson examined the document. "This appears to be an order, Mrs. Campbell," she said. Roger's mouth opened and closed like a goldfish. He hadn't expected this. He'd grown too comfortable assuming I was exactly what he wanted me to be. A convenient, doddering old lady with a substantial estate and no capacity to protect it. "Shall we proceed with the property transfer to my name only?" "Then?" I asked Miss Patterson, not sparing a glance for my speechless son-in-law. That moment, seeing Roger's shocked expression as he realized his plans were crumbling, was just the beginning of my reclaiming what was mine. But to understand how we got there, to that moment of vindication, I need to take you back 6 months. To when I first discovered what my daughter and her husband had been planning behind my back. The morning had started like any other since Frank passed away 2 years ago. I woke up at 6:30 a.m., made a single cup of coffee in the kitchen Frank had renovated for our 40th anniversary, and sat in my usual spot on the porch of our colonial home in Fairfield, Connecticut. The neighborhood was quiet, one of the reasons we'd bought this place 37 years ago. The maple trees Frank had planted were now mature giants, their leaves just beginning to hint at the fall colors that would soon transform our street. I'd been living alone in this house since Frank's heart attack, and managing just fine despite what my daughter seemed to think. Elizabeth had been pushing for me to downsize, practically since we'd held Frank's funeral. At first I thought it was genuine concern. The house was large for one person, the stairs could be challenging, the maintenance was constant. But that morning, as I sipped my coffee, my neighbor Harriet Blackwell crossed the perfectly manicured lawn that separated our properties. Harriet and I weren't particularly close, but we'd been neighbors for decades. Her husband Tom had been Frank's golf partner, and we'd exchanged Christmas cards and pleasantries at neighborhood functions over the years. She was clutching her robe around her despite the mild September morning, and her face held an expression of determined purpose that immediately put me on alert. "Margaret," she called, using my first name, though we'd always been Mrs. Campbell and Mrs. Blackwell to each other. "Do you have a minute?" I invited her onto the porch, offered coffee, which she declined, and waited while she settled into Frank's old wicker chair, clearly uncomfortable with whatever had propelled her across our adjoining lawns at 7 in the morning. "I'm not one to meddle," she began, which in my experience was exactly how people started when they were about to do precisely that. "But Tom and I saw the real estate agent taking pictures yesterday." I set my coffee cup down carefully. "I'm sorry? The for sale sign isn't up yet, but the Caldwell agency was definitely here. The woman was measuring and photographing everything. We assumed you'd finally decided to sell." My hands began to tremble. But not from age, from a cold, creeping dread. "Harriet, I haven't contacted any real estate agents. This house isn't for sale." She looked genuinely confused. But the agent specifically mentioned the Campbell property. Tom spoke with her briefly when she was photographing the exterior. She said they were preparing the listing for next week. Just waiting for some paperwork to be finalized. I thanked Harriet as calmly as I could, promised to clear up the misunderstanding, and somehow maintained my composure until she left. Then I pulled out my phone and called Caldwell Real Estate. The receptionist cheerfully confirmed that yes, they were preparing to list the property at 247 Maple Avenue, and that I could speak with Elizabeth Campbell Peterson, who was handling the sale on behalf of her elderly mother. I hung up without responding and sat very still on my porch, watching the neighborhood come to life around me. The Walsh children waiting for their school bus. Mr. Rodriguez walking his ridiculous little dog. The familiar rhythm of a community where I'd raised my family, buried my husband, and apparently was now being erased without my knowledge or consent. I didn't call Elizabeth immediately. Instead, I made another call to my sister Margaret in Boston. Margaret was 3 years younger than me at 62, sharp as a tack, and had never particularly cared for Roger. She'd warned me years ago that he had small eyes, which in our mother's parlance meant he couldn't be trusted. I dismissed it as Margaret being overprotective. Now I was beginning to think she'd been right all along. "Maggie," I said when she answered, "I need your advice on something, and I need you to not overreact." I told her everything, the real estate agent, the listing being prepared, the fact that somehow my daughter was selling my home without my knowledge. Margaret didn't interrupt, but I could almost hear her blood pressure rising through the phone. "Have you given Elizabeth power of attorney?" she finally asked, her voice carefully controlled. "After Frank died, yes. The lawyer suggested it would be simpler for emergency medical decisions and managing accounts if something happened to me. Elizabeth and Roger are both on it." The silence on Margaret's end was deafening. "Maggie? I'm coming to Connecticut," she said finally. "Today. Don't confront them yet. Don't let them know you know anything. We need to figure out exactly what they're doing before we stop it." Margaret arrived that evening, having driven the 2 hours from Boston in record time. She'd brought her laptop, a folder of legal documents, and a determination that bordered on frightening. We sat at my kitchen table, the beautiful cherry wood that Frank had saved for years to buy me, and began to unravel just how deeply my daughter and son-in-law had embedded themselves into my financial life. It started innocently enough after Frank's death. Elizabeth had helped me organize his papers, close some accounts, open others. She'd been there when I met with the attorney about the will, the life insurance, the pension. When the lawyer suggested a power of attorney, it had seemed sensible. Elizabeth was my only child, my next of kin. If something happened to me, a fall, a stroke, anything that might leave me temporarily unable to manage my affairs. Someone needed to be able to step in. What I hadn't fully understood was just how comprehensive the power that document gave them. Not just for emergencies, but for everyday decisions, and not just to Elizabeth, but to Roger as well. "They could empty your accounts right now if they wanted to," Margaret said bluntly, after reviewing the paperwork I'd kept in Frank's old filing cabinet. "They could sell this house, move you anywhere, and legally you wouldn't have much recourse because you've given them prior authorization." I shook my head, not wanting to believe my only child could be so duplicitous. There must be some misunderstanding. Elizabeth wouldn't do this. Margaret's expression softened. Maybe not Elizabeth alone, but Roger? That man has always had his eye on your nest egg, Margie, and people can rationalize anything if they convince themselves it's for someone else's good. The next day, while Elizabeth thought I was at my weekly bridge game, Margaret and I went to my bank. With my ID and account information, we requested the last 6 months of statements for all my accounts. The assistant manager was hesitant until I firmly reminded him that I was the primary account holder, not my daughter. and that I had every right to my own financial information. When he printed the statements and slid them across the desk, Margaret and I leaned in together to examine them. The evidence was there in black and white, small withdrawals at first, $500 here, $1,000 there. $30,000 transferred directly to an account I didn't recognize just 3 weeks ago. "That's nearly $50,000 they've taken," Margaret whispered, her finger tracing the withdrawals. "And I bet this Next Home Transitions is some kind of senior living placement service." I felt physically ill, not just at the money, not the image of my daughter and Roger sitting at their kitchen table, planning how to liquidate my life while I remained oblivious. The casual disregard for my wishes, my independence, my very personhood. "I want to change my power of attorney," I said firmly. "Today." Margaret nodded. "And we need to find out what other paperwork they might have filed using your name. The house, your investments, everything." We spent the next week in careful investigation. I maintained my normal routines, my bridge game, my volunteer shift at the library, my regular Sunday dinner with Elizabeth, Roger, and their children. I smiled and nodded when Elizabeth mentioned that she'd found this lovely retirement community she thought I might want to visit, just to see what options are out there. Behind the scenes, Margaret and I were building a case and reclaiming control. We visited my attorney, not the one who had drawn up the original power of attorney, but a new one recommended by Margaret's friend who specialized in elder law. We filed a new power of attorney naming Margaret as my sole proxy. We froze my major accounts and required dual authentication for any withdrawals. We contacted the real estate agency and informed them that the house was not, in fact, for sale, and any listing agreement would be fraudulent. But the most difficult step was still ahead, confronting Elizabeth and Roger with what we knew. I wanted to believe my daughter was being manipulated by Roger, that she couldn't possibly be fully complicit in this scheme to rob her own mother of her home and savings. Margaret wasn't so sure. "People get weird about money and inheritance," she said as we prepared for the Sunday dinner, where we planned to confront them. "Especially when they feel entitled to it." I couldn't argue with that. Roger had always lived slightly beyond his means. The house in the more exclusive neighborhood they couldn't quite afford. The private schools for the children, the country club membership. Elizabeth had absorbed his values over their 20-year marriage, becoming increasingly focused on appearances and status. Still, to go from materialism to outright theft from her widowed mother seemed a chasm too wide to believe she had crossed willingly. Sunday dinner arrived, and with it, Elizabeth, Roger, and my 2 teenage grandchildren, Sophie and James. The kids immediately disappeared upstairs, Sophie to call friends, James to play video games, leaving the adults in the kitchen. Elizabeth busied herself helping me with the roast while Roger poured drinks. "Mom, we've been thinking," Elizabeth began, accepting the glass of wine Roger handed her. "With winter coming, those stairs are going to be more difficult. Remember last year when you slipped on the ice getting the mail?" I had slipped once and caught myself on the mailbox without injury. Apparently, this minor incident was now being recast as evidence of my inability to care for myself. "I'm quite careful with the ice, dear," I replied mildly. "Frank always kept sand in the garage for the driveway, and I still use it." "But you shouldn't have to worry about things like that," Roger interjected smoothly. "That's why we've been looking into some really nice communities, not nursing homes," he added quickly, seeing my expression. "Independent living apartments specifically designed for active seniors. No maintenance, no stairs, social activities built right in." "How thoughtful," I said, locking eyes with him. "And how do you propose I pay for such a place? They're quite expensive, I understand." Elizabeth waved dismissively. "That's the beauty of it, Mom. Once we sell this house, you'll have more than enough. The market is excellent right now. The equity you've built up over 37 years will easily cover a lovely apartment at Sunset Meadows with plenty left for your other needs. Sunset Meadows, I repeated. Is that the place that Next Home Transitions recommended? The company you paid $12,000 of my money to consult? The kitchen went silent. Elizabeth's hand froze on the spoon she'd been using to stir the gravy. Roger's smile remained fixed, but his eyes darted to my daughter in alarm. Or perhaps you were thinking of using the $30,000 you transferred from my savings account last month, I continued. My voice steadied despite my racing heart. I'm curious what that money was for, actually. A down payment on my prison cell at Sunset Meadows, perhaps. Mom, Elizabeth began, her voice strained. I don't know what you're talking about. We've been using a little of your money to research options for you. Yes, but it's all for your benefit. $50,000 is not a little of my money, Elizabeth, I interrupted. That's theft. And attempting to sell my house without my knowledge or consent, that's fraud. Roger set his drink down with a thud. Now wait just a minute, he said, his voice taking on the condescending tone I'd heard him use with service workers. You gave us power of attorney precisely so we could help manage these affairs. We're looking out for your best interests, even if you can't see that right now. My best interests, I repeated. Tell me, Roger, how exactly does emptying my bank account serve my best interests? You're exaggerating, he scoffed. We've used some funds to secure your place at Sunset Meadows, yes. There's a waiting list and deposits are required. The rest has gone to consultants who are helping us manage this transition. You should be thanking us for taking care of these details so you don't have to worry about them. I looked at my daughter, searching her face for any sign of shame or regret. Instead, I saw only defensive anger building. Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this, she said. This house is too big for you. You're isolated here. What if you fall? What if you need help? We're just trying to make sure you're safe and cared for before there's a crisis. By stealing from me? I asked quietly. By going behind my back to sell my home. That's how you show care. We're not stealing, Elizabeth's voice rose. It's going to be our inheritance anyway. We're just being practical about the timing. The room went still at her outburst. Even Roger looked uncomfortable with her stark admission. I see, I said finally. So this isn't about my well-being at all. It's about your impatience to get your hands on what you believe you're entitled to. That's not what she meant, Roger jumped in. Elizabeth is just frustrated because you're being stubborn about something that's inevitable. You can't stay here forever. Margaret, being proactive is the responsible thing to do. I agree completely, I said, reaching into my pocket for the folded document I'd been carrying all day. That's why I've taken some proactive steps of my own. I slid the paper across the kitchen island towards them. This is a notification that I've revoked your power of attorney. My sister Margaret is now my sole proxy for financial and medical decisions. Roger snatched up the document, his face darkening as he scanned it. This isn't legal, he sputtered. You can't just... It's perfectly legal, I interrupted. I had it properly executed and notarized last Tuesday. I've also frozen all my accounts and notified the real estate agency that any listing agreement for this property is fraudulent. Oh, and I've scheduled a meeting with the police tomorrow to discuss the unauthorized withdrawals from my accounts. Elizabeth had gone very pale. You're going to report us to the police? Your own daughter? That depends, I said, feeling a strange calm despite the storm raging around my kitchen island. If the money is returned in full by the end of the week, perhaps we can handle this as a family matter. If not, I let the implication hang in the air. Roger's face had turned an alarming shade of red. This is ridiculous. We've done nothing wrong. You gave us authority to act in my best interest, I finished for him. Not to rob me blind and sell my home out from under me. I'm not confused, Roger. I'm not incapacitated. I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. and I've decided I don't want either of you having control over my life or my money anymore." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, whether from shame or frustration. I couldn't tell. "Mom, please. We were trying to help. Maybe we went about it the wrong way, but—" "The wrong way?" I laughed, a short, harsh sound that surprised even me. "Elizabeth, you were planning to move me out of my home without my consent. You've taken nearly $50,000 of my money. What exactly would the right way to do that have looked like?" The timer on the oven buzzed, an absurdly normal sound in the midst of our family implosion. I turned away to remove the roast, using the moment to compose myself. "I think," I said finally, my back still turned, "that dinner is cancelled. I'd like you all to leave now." "Mom," Elizabeth started. "Now," I repeated, still not looking at them. "Take the children and go. We'll talk when you're ready to return my money and be honest about what you've done." They left finally, after more protests and justifications that I refused to engage with. Roger maintained their righteous indignation to the end, but Elizabeth seemed deflated as she herded the confused teenagers to the car. I watched from the window as they drove away, then sat alone at my dining room table with the cooling roast beef and congealing gravy, wondering how we had come to this point. Margaret returned from her hotel an hour later. We'd agreed she would make herself scarce during the confrontation to prevent it from feeling like an ambush. I recounted the conversation while she poured us both generous glasses of Frank's good whiskey that I'd been saving for special occasions. "So they admitted it," she said, settling across from me. "Not just the money, but the whole plan to liquidate your life without your input." "Elizabeth actually said it was going to be their inheritance anyway," I repeated, still stunned by my daughter's entitled perspective. As if that justifies taking it while I'm still alive and might need it. Margaret shook her head. "The question is, what do you want to do now? Do you really want to involve the police?" I sipped the whiskey, feeling the familiar burn. Frank and I had shared this bottle on special anniversaries, and I'd been saving the last of it. Now seemed as good a time as any to finish it. "I want my money back," I said finally, "and I want them to understand they can't treat me this way. But no, I don't want my daughter and son-in-law arrested if it can be avoided. That would devastate the grandchildren." "Then we need leverage," Margaret said practically. "Something that motivates them to make this right without legal action." We spent the next few days strategizing. I called the bank and confirmed exactly how much had been withdrawn. 47,832.16 in total, and from which accounts. I gathered all the paperwork showing the timeline of withdrawals. Margaret, meanwhile, did some research into Roger's business dealings. Roger owned a moderately successful real estate development company that specialized in converting old industrial buildings into luxury lofts for young professionals. His projects were generally small scale, a warehouse here, an old factory there, but he'd built a reputation in certain circles. What we discovered through Margaret's diligent research and a few well-placed calls to former business associates was that Roger's latest project was in trouble. The conversion of an old paper mill was behind schedule and over budget. The construction loans were coming due, and pre-sales weren't where they needed to be. "So that explains the urgency," Margaret said, showing me the permit applications and loan documents she'd managed to obtain through public records. "They don't just want your money someday. They need it now to bail out Roger's failing project." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Roger's increasingly frequent questions about my investments over the past year. Elizabeth's accelerated timeline for getting me to downsize. The rush to list the house before I even knew it was for sale. They weren't just being greedy, they were desperate. 3 days after our confrontation, Elizabeth called. Her voice was subdued, lacking the righteous indignation of our last encounter. "Mom, can we talk? In person?" I agreed to meet her, alone without Roger, at a coffee shop halfway between our homes. When she arrived, I barely recognized my daughter. Gone was the polished, confident woman who managed charity galas and country club committees. In her place was someone who looked like she hadn't slept in days, her hair hastily pulled back, her usual careful makeup minimal. "I've convinced Roger to return the money," she said, after ordering a coffee she didn't touch. "All of it. He's arranging the transfers today." I nodded, waiting for more. Elizabeth stared into her untouched cup. "I need you to understand," she continued finally. "We didn't start out planning to take your money. It began with genuine concern. After Dad died, you seemed so lost. The house is too big for one person. The maintenance, the taxes. We worried about you being there alone. There's a wide gulf between concern and theft." "Elizabeth!" She flinched. "I know. It escalated. Roger's project ran into problems. The construction costs went up. The bank threatened to call the loan. He convinced me it was just a temporary solution. We'd borrow from your accounts just until the project was back on track. You'd never even notice. But it wasn't just borrowing, was it? You were actively planning to sell my home and move me into Sunset Meadows." Elizabeth had the grace to look ashamed. "That part started, honestly. We really did think a senior community would be safer for you. But yes, we also needed the equity from the house. Roger said once you were settled at Sunset Meadows, you'd see it was for the best and forgive us for pushing you into it. I studied my daughter, this woman I'd raised, trying to reconcile the child who'd once had such a strong sense of right and wrong with the adult sitting before me who had rationalized stealing from her widowed mother. Do you understand what you've done? Elizabeth, not just the money, you betrayed my trust. You treated me like I was incapable of making my own decisions. You decided my home, my life savings, were yours to appropriate." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I know. And I'm so sorry, Mom. I got caught up in Roger's panic about the project failing. About losing everything we've built. He kept saying it was just temporary, that we'd pay it all back before you ever knew. And you believed that." She wiped her tears with a napkin. I wanted to believe it. It was easier than admitting what we were really doing. She looked up at me, eyes red-rimmed. Eyes. "Are you going to press charges?" I'd thought about this question extensively over the past few days. The betrayal warranted consequences, certainly, but criminal charges would tear apart what remained of our family. My grandchildren would be devastated, and despite everything, Elizabeth was still my only child. If the money is returned in full by the end of the week, and if you both sign a legally binding agreement acknowledging what happened and relinquishing any claim to power of attorney over my affairs, then no, I won't involve the police." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you, Mom. I promise—" "I'm not finished," I interrupted. "I want something else as well." "Anything," she said quickly. "I want you in therapy. Not couples counseling with Roger, though he clearly needs help too. Individual therapy for you, to understand how you could justify doing this to your own mother." Elizabeth blinked, clearly not expecting this condition. Okay, if that's what you want." "It is, and one more thing. Until further notice, Roger is not welcome in my home. You and the children can visit, but he cannot." Her face fell. "Mom, he's my husband. We're a family. He orchestrated stealing nearly $50,000 from me and tried to sell my home without my knowledge." "Those aren't the actions of family, Elizabeth." She didn't argue further, just nodded miserably. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a few moments. "What about the grandchildren?" she finally asked. "What will we tell them?" I hadn't considered this aspect yet. Sophie and James were 15 and 17, old enough to notice the sudden rift, but perhaps not old enough to understand its complexities. "We'll tell them we're working through some adult disagreements," I said finally. "They don't need to know the details, but I won't lie to them either if they ask direct questions." Elizabeth nodded again, seeming to shrink in her seat. I should go. I'll call you when the transfers are complete. I watched her walk away. Shoulders hunched and felt a complex mixture of anger, sadness, and a mother's instinctive desire to comfort her child, even when that child had wronged me. But I held firm. Consequences were necessary, not just as punishment, but as the only path to potential reconciliation. The money was returned in full by the end of that week, transferred back into my accounts in 3 large deposits. Roger's signature was on the paperwork my attorney drew up, though he didn't attend the signing in person. Elizabeth signed with tears in her eyes, but didn't try to justify their actions again or minimize what they had done. The following weeks were quiet. Margaret returned to Boston after making sure I had all the protections in place: new accounts at a different bank, updated estate planning documents, security systems for the house, and regular check-ins with her. I resumed my normal routines: bridge on Wednesdays, library volunteering on Thursdays, gardening when the weather permitted. Elizabeth called daily, brief, awkward conversations that neither of us seemed to know how to navigate. The grandchildren visited one weekend, carefully coached to not mention the rift, though Sophie, always perceptive, asked pointed questions about why her father couldn't come with them. I was beginning to think we'd reached a new normal, distant but civil, when Roger unexpectedly appeared on my doorstep one Tuesday afternoon in late October. The fall colors were at their peak, the maple trees Frank had planted now a brilliant display of reds and golds against the clear blue sky. Roger stood on my porch amid all that beauty, looking diminished somehow. His usual polished appearance was intact, but something in his bearing had changed. "Margaret," he said, using my first name, though he'd always called me Mom before. "May I come in? Just for a few minutes?" Against my better judgment, I stepped aside to let him enter. We sat in the living room, me in Frank's old recliner, Roger perched uncomfortably on the edge of the sofa, where he'd sat countless times during family gatherings. "I won't waste your time with excuses," he began, surprising me. "What we did was wrong. Deeply, unforgivably wrong. I led Elizabeth into it, manipulated her concerns about your welfare to serve my financial needs. I've come to apologize and to tell you I understand why you don't want me in your home." I studied him, looking for the tells he usually displayed when being less than honest: the slight tilt of his head, the too direct eye contact. They weren't present, but I'd been fooled before. "Why now, Roger? It's been nearly a month." He sighed, rubbing his hands together nervously. "My project failed anyway. The bank foreclosed last week. We're going to lose a significant amount of money, but I've accepted that. I've also started seeing a therapist like Elizabeth. It was actually my idea, not just your condition for her. And what has therapy taught you in these few weeks? That I've been living a lie, pretending to be more successful than I am, spending more than we should, all to maintain some image that doesn't even matter." He looked around the room, at the comfortable, well-worn furniture that Frank and I had collected over decades. "You and Frank built something real, a home, a life with actual meaning. I've been chasing status symbols and calling it success." I wasn't entirely convinced by this sudden epiphany, but there was a rawness to his words that seemed genuine. "What do you want from me, Roger? Forgiveness? Permission to return to Sunday dinners as if nothing happened?" He shook his head. "I don't expect forgiveness. I wouldn't forgive someone who did what I did. I needed you to know that I understand now. The damage I caused, not just to your bank account, but to our family, to your relationship with Elizabeth, to your trust." We talked for another half-hour. Roger explained that his business was being dismantled, assets sold to cover debts. He and Elizabeth were downsizing, selling their too expensive home to move into something more reasonable. He'd taken a salaried position with a larger development firm, a step down in prestige but steady income to rebuild from. When he left, I wasn't ready to welcome him back into my life, but I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. Hope that perhaps this painful episode might lead to genuine growth, not just for Roger, but for Elizabeth, for their marriage, for our fractured family. The reconciliation, when it came, was gradual. Small steps over the following months. Sunday dinners resumed, initially tense affairs where we carefully avoided certain topics, eventually warming into something approaching normal. Elizabeth continued her therapy, sometimes sharing insights that surprised me with their self-awareness. Roger remained respectful of my boundaries, never presuming forgiveness, but consistently demonstrating changed behavior. By the time the spring arrived, bringing new life to Frank's garden that I still carefully tended, we had established a new relationship, more honest, more equal, with clearly defined boundaries that everyone respected. I remained in my home, managing my own affairs with occasional assistance from Margaret or Elizabeth, but never surrendering my autonomy again. And that brings us back to the notary's office, 6 months after discovering their betrayal. Roger had accompanied me there under the pretense of helping with some paperwork, only to reveal he was still hoping to control my financial decisions. His shocked face when I produced the updated power of attorney was a moment of vindication, proof that I had reclaimed not just my legal rights, but my dignity. As we left the notary's office that day, Roger silent beside me, I felt a strange sense of gratitude for the ordeal we had weathered, not for the betrayal itself, which had wounded me deeply, but for the clarity it had brought. The experience had forced all of us to confront uncomfortable truths. Elizabeth's willingness to compromise her integrity under pressure, Roger's desperate materialism, my own reluctance to acknowledge my daughter's flaws. "I really am sorry," Roger said as we reached my car. "For everything. For today. I don't know what I thought." "That I might have forgotten," I suggested mildly, "or forgiven so completely that I'd hand control back to you." He had the grace to look ashamed. "Old habits, I guess." "Some lessons need to be learned more than once," I said, unlocking my car door. "This one, I hope, has finally stuck." He nodded, and I saw in his expression something I'd rarely observed in Roger before: respect. Not the performative deference he'd shown the elderly mother of his wife, but genuine recognition of me as a person with agency and wisdom. I drove home to the house Frank and I had shared for 37 years, the home where we'd raised Elizabeth, hosted countless holidays, and built a life of quiet dignity. The spring flowers were blooming along the walkway, crocuses and daffodils Frank had planted decades ago, still returning faithfully each year. Inside, I made a cup of tea and sat in my favorite spot on the porch, watching the neighborhood children play as the afternoon sun filtered through the maple trees. At 65, I had learned that family could be both your greatest vulnerability and your strongest support. That trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, but never quite the same as before. That standing firm in your own truths sometimes meant standing alone, at least temporarily, but most importantly, I'd learned that I was still capable of defending myself, of demanding respect, of forgiving without forgetting. Frank would have been proud, I thought, not just of my standing up to Roger and Elizabeth, but of my finding a path to reconciliation that preserved my dignity without destroying our family. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Elizabeth calling to check if I'd returned home safely. A small gesture, but one that reflected our new, more balanced relationship. As we chatted about ordinary things, Sophie's college applications, James's baseball team, the community garden project I'd joined, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was not the retirement I had envisioned when Frank was alive. The path had been rockier, the challenges more painful. But sitting on my porch, in my home, Surrounded by memories of the life we'd built and the new boundaries I'd established, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. Not as a confused old lady to be managed and manipulated, but as Margaret Campbell, widow, mother, grandmother, and a woman very much in command of her own destiny. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.